If you help me, they'll kill you too. The girl said it with both hands locked around the sleeve of Ethan Mercer's jacket, while the entire market around them went silent. 1 second earlier, the lower exchange district of Carth Station had been drowning in noise. Vendors shouting over each other in 6 different languages. Cargo drones whining overhead beneath flickering neon strips. The smell of machine oil, burned sugar, hot metal, and overcrowded bodies hanging heavy beneath the station's recycled air. Then the girl ran out of the crowd and grabbed him. And suddenly it felt like somebody had pulled all the sound out of the world. Ethan stopped walking. He looked down slowly at the small violet hand gripping his coat, sleeve hard enough to shake. The girl couldn't have been older than 20 by human standards. Thin shoulders. White hair tangled like she'd been sleeping in maintenance ducts for weeks. Pale amethyst skin dulled by dirt and exhaustion. Her breathing came fast and uneven, and her silver violet eyes kept darting over her shoulder toward the upper market levels behind her. Terrified eyes. Not dramatic fear. Not panic meant to attract attention. The kind of fear that had already gone on too long and burned itself quiet. Please, she whispered again. Take me with you. Ethan stared at her for half a second longer before noticing the people around them. Nobody was moving. A 6-foot insectoid merchant froze beside a fruit cart with one claw still hovering over a payment scanner. 2 armored dock workers lowered their voices mid-conversation. Even the transit officers near the escalator platform suddenly found other places to look. Nobody wanted to be involved. Ethan felt the weight of every eye in the market shift toward him at once. Human. Outsider. Disposable if things went wrong. He exhaled slowly through his nose. You've got the wrong guy, he said quietly. His voice came out rough from too many years breathing station air and not enough sleep. I'm not local. The girl tightened her grip instead of letting go. I know, she whispered. That's why. Somewhere deeper in the crowd, metal boots hit the floor in synchronized rhythm. Security. Patrol. The girl heard it too. Ethan felt it instantly in the way her body reacted. She flinched so hard her shoulders nearly folded inward before she caught herself. That movement bothered him more than the pleading. People who lived scared learned to hide it. Reflexes like that came from repetition. Ethan followed her gaze toward the upper ramps. 3 station officers were moving through the market with scanning drones hovering behind them, their black uniforms cutting through the crowd like oil through water. Nobody met their eyes. Nobody slowed them down. One of the drones turned briefly in Ethan's direction. The girl stepped closer behind his shoulder immediately, using his body like cover without even thinking about it. Ethan looked down at her again. Up close, she looked worse. Bruising along one wrist. Cracked lips. Shadows under her eyes dark enough to look painted there. She smelled faintly like cold metal and recycled air filters, the smell of somebody hiding in maintenance spaces instead of sleeping in a bed. One of the officers spoke sharply into a radio. The girl's fingers tightened painfully around Ethan's sleeve. Don't let them take me back, she whispered. Ethan closed his eyes for 1 second. He had missed 3 cargo deadlines already this month. His ship needed a new coolant regulator. He had exactly enough credits left to buy the part and leave Carth Station before docking fees buried him alive. None of this was his problem. None of it. Then he opened his eyes again and saw the way the girl was trying not to shake. Not crying. Not begging anymore. Just standing there beside the only human in the market looking at him like she had already run out of places to go. Behind them, one of the merchants finally muttered under his breath, low enough that only Ethan could hear it. Human, the old alien said quietly. If you're smart, you'll walk away now. Ethan should have walked away. He knew that before the old merchant finished speaking. He knew it when the security drones drifted closer through the market traffic with their pale blue scanners sweeping over faces and cargo crates. He knew it when he saw 3 different vendors suddenly lower. Their eyes like they were afraid, even looking at the girl might attach them to whatever trouble was coming. Smart people survived places like Carth Station by staying invisible. Ethan had survived 11 years doing exactly that. Quiet jobs. Quiet departures. Never staying long enough for anybody to remember his name. The girl beside him made that impossible the second she grabbed his sleeve. Please, she whispered again, softer this time. I can pay you later. Ethan almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because she looked like somebody who had not eaten a real meal in days. He glanced toward the upper walkways again. The officers were closer now, moving steadily through the crowd while the station drones projected rotating identification symbols across nearby walls. Missing person notices. Wanted notices. Transit alerts. He caught only fragments before the images changed again. Unauthorized movement. Sector lockdown in progress. Report suspicious activity immediately. The girl saw him reading. Do not look at the screens, she said quickly. Please. Ethan studied her face for a moment. She was scared, but there was something underneath the fear too. Training. Awareness. The way she tracked exits and patrol routes did not belong to somebody helpless. It belonged to somebody who had spent a very long time surviving. What did you do? He asked quietly. Her expression changed instantly. Not guilt. Pain. Like the question itself hurt. Nothing, she said after a second. That is the problem. One of the drones turned sharply toward them. The soft mechanical hum deepened as its scanner focused. The girl stepped behind Ethan so quickly her shoulder hit the middle of his back. Ethan felt her shaking through his jacket. The drone paused 3 yards away. A pale beam swept across Ethan's face first. Human identification markers flashed briefly across its lens. Temporary dock access. Cargo certification. Low priority. Then the scanner shifted toward the girl. Ethan moved without really deciding to. Just half a step sideways. Enough to block the scan. The drone hesitated. Its lens adjusted once. Twice. Then a voice crackled from one of the nearby. Officers. Move along. Keep the corridor clear. The drone obeyed immediately and drifted back toward the crowd. Ethan stared after it for a moment. Then he muttered something under his breath he had not said in years. Damn it. The girl looked up at him carefully, like she was afraid even breathing too loudly might change his mind. You should leave me, she whispered. I know, but you are not leaving. Ethan rubbed one hand across his face. She was right. That annoyed him more than anything else. Somewhere above them, station alarms pulsed once through the overhead speakers. Not loud enough for panic, just enough to tell everybody something was wrong. Around them, merchants started closing stalls early. Metal shutters rolled down across storefronts with heavy mechanical clanks. Foot traffic shifted direction all at once toward the outer transit rings. People were leaving before the lockdown got worse. The old merchant from earlier caught Ethan's eye briefly from across the walkway. Then the alien gave the smallest shake of his head and disappeared behind a closing security partition. Ethan exhaled slowly. All right, he said at last. The girl blinked. What? I know a maintenance route near Dock 17. He adjusted the strap of his worn cargo bag on one shoulder and glanced toward the nearest freight corridor. If we move now, we can avoid most of the station patrols before they seal the lower levels. For the first time since she grabbed his sleeve, the girl looked genuinely surprised. Not relieved, not happy, just shocked somebody had actually chosen to help her. Ethan noticed that expression more than he wanted to. Do not thank me yet, he said quietly. I have a feeling this is going to ruin my week. Then he started walking toward the freight sector, and after half a second of hesitation, the girl followed so close behind him her trembling hand almost brushed the back of his jacket the entire way. The freight sector sat beneath the public levels of Karth Station, like the inside of an old machine nobody cared enough to replace. The air changed the deeper Ethan, and the girl moved into the lower corridors. Less spice smoke and market food. More. Cold metal, hydraulic fluid, overheated wiring, and recycled coolant leaking somewhere behind the walls. The lighting strips overhead flickered every few seconds, washing the narrow passageways in pale white, and then shadow again. Ethan moved quickly without looking hurried. Years around cargo docks had taught him that looking nervous attracted attention faster than almost anything else. The girl stayed close behind him in complete silence. He noticed she never walked in the center of a hallway. Always near walls. Near corners. Places where she could see exits. What is your name? He asked finally without turning around. There was a brief pause behind him before she answered. Lyra. Just Lyra. Another pause. Yes. Ethan nodded once even though he did not believe that for a second. People hiding from station security rarely used their full names. Ahead of them, a freight lift groaned somewhere deep inside the docking structure. The sound echoed through the metal corridor like distant thunder. Ethan slowed near an intersection and checked the security mirrors mounted high in the corners. Empty. Good. You hungry? He asked. Lyra hesitated before answering, which told him enough already. No, Ethan glanced back at her. She looked exhausted, pale under the station lights. Her silver hair still carried dust from the market levels, and every few steps she rubbed absently at one wrist where the bruising darkened beneath her skin. That was not a real answer, he said. For the first time, something faint and uncertain moved across her face. Not quite a smile. More like she remembered what one looked like. I have been hungry before, she said quietly. Ethan stopped walking long enough to pull a wrapped protein bar from the side pocket of his cargo bag. Station issue. Terrible taste. Enough calories to keep dock workers moving through 14-hour shifts. He handed it back toward her without ceremony. Lyra froze immediately. Her eyes locked onto the food, then lifted cautiously toward his face like she expected conditions attached to the gesture. Ethan waited. Finally, she reached out slowly and took it with both hands. She opened the wrapper carefully at first, then faster once the smell hit her. Ethan looked away before she started eating. People deserved at least that much dignity. They continued deeper into the freight district while station announcements echoed faintly overhead. Security advisory in effect. Civilian movement restricted between sectors 9 through 14. Report suspicious activity immediately. Lyra's shoulders tightened every time the speakers activated. Ethan noticed she ate silently and extremely fast, finishing the entire bar in less than 30 seconds before folding the wrapper into a tiny square and slipping it into her pocket instead of throwing it away. Survival habit. Waste nothing. You have somewhere safe? He asked after a while. Lyra shook her head once. No family. This time she did not answer at all. Ethan let the silence sit between them. He knew better than to force people into rooms they were trying to keep locked. They reached an older maintenance junction near Dock 17, where most of the overhead lights had burned out years ago. The corridor beyond remained dark except for weak red emergency strips along the floor. Ethan slowed suddenly. Lyra nearly walked into his back before stopping herself. Voices drifted faintly from somewhere ahead. Security officers. 2 of them at least. Ethan motioned silently toward a recessed maintenance alcove built into the wall beside them. Lyra moved into the shadows immediately, without question. Ethan stepped in after her, and the space became very small very quickly. He could hear her breathing. Fast. Controlled only by effort. The officers passed the corridor entrance a few seconds later with scanning drones floating beside them. Orders came from upper administration, one of them muttered. They want her found before transport arrives. Why? The other asked. A long pause followed. Above our pay grade. The footsteps faded slowly into the distance. Ethan stayed still a moment longer before exhaling quietly. Then he realized something. During the entire exchange, Lyra had been gripping the sleeve of his jacket again, with both shaking hands like she was afraid the second she let go, somebody would take her away. The maintenance alcove stayed silent long after the officers disappeared. Ethan could still hear the distant hum of the drones somewhere deeper in the freight sector, drifting through the station like mechanical insects searching for heat. Beside him, Lyra had not let go of his sleeve. Her hands were small and cold through the fabric of his jacket, trembling slightly every time another announcement echoed overhead. Ethan looked down at her fingers for a second before speaking quietly. They are gone. Lyra released him immediately and stepped back like she had done something wrong. Sorry, she whispered. Ethan shook his head once. You do not have to apologize every 30 seconds. She lowered her eyes without answering. That bothered him too. They left the alcove a minute later and continued through the lower maintenance corridors beneath Dock 17. The deeper levels of Karth Station were older than the public sectors above them by at least 40 years. Pipes lined the ceilings in tangled rows thick enough to crawl through. Water condensation dripped steadily somewhere inside the walls. Every few yards, faded yellow warning signs still clung to rusted doors nobody opened anymore. Ethan knew the area because he had repaired cargo loaders here twice last winter for a shipping company too cheap to hire licensed crews. Most civilians avoided the lower levels after dark, which made them useful. Lyra walked silently beside him now instead of behind him. Still cautious, still tense, but close enough that he could hear the uneven rhythm of her breathing whenever station alarms sounded overhead. How long have they been looking for you? He asked. She stared ahead for several steps before answering. Since yesterday. Ethan glanced sideways at her. That is a lot of station security for one missing girl. Her expression tightened immediately. Wrong question. He let it drop. Ahead, a heavy blast door stood partially opened beside an abandoned loading platform. Ethan stepped inside first, scanning the old storage room automatically out of habit. Empty. Dust layered across and used cargo crates stacked along the walls. One emergency light still worked near the ceiling, washing the room. In weak amber light. Good enough for a temporary stop. Sit down for a minute, he said. Lyra hesitated before lowering herself carefully onto the edge of a storage crate nearest the wall. Not the center of the room. Never the center. Ethan set his cargo bag beside an old terminal and checked the portable station map on his wrist display. Most transit routes above them were already turning red under security lockdown. He muttered quietly under his breath. Perfect. You helped me anyway, Lyra said softly. Ethan looked up. She was watching him now with that same careful expression she always used, like she expected kindness to disappear the second she acknowledged it. He shrugged slightly. I am starting to think I make bad decisions professionally. To his surprise, Lyra let out the faintest sound that almost resembled a laugh. Tiny, uncertain, like she had forgotten how. Then it disappeared again just as quickly when a loud metallic bang echoed somewhere beyond the room. Her whole body tensed instantly. Ethan noticed it before he even processed the sound itself. Lyra's shoulders locked. Her breathing stopped. One hand grabbed the edge of the crate so tightly her knuckles paled beneath her violet skin. Ethan listened. Another cargo container shifting somewhere down the docking line. Nothing else. Easy, he said quietly. Just the freight rails. Lyra nodded once, but she still looked pale beneath the amber light. Ethan opened another side pocket on his bag and pulled out a dented metal water flask. He held it toward her. Slow this time, he said. Lyra took it carefully with both hands. She drank exactly one sip before lowering it again. Controlled. Deliberate. Different from earlier. Ethan leaned back against the terminal behind him and studied her for a moment without meaning to. Up close, she looked even younger when she stopped trying to hide the exhaustion. Strands of silver-white hair fell loose across her face. There was a faint scar near the edge of her jaw he had not noticed before. Old. Thin. Her eyes lifted suddenly and caught him looking. Ethan glanced away first. You said you picked me because I was human, he said after a moment. Why? Lyra stared down at the water flask in her hands. For several seconds, Ethan thought she would not answer at all. Then she spoke so quietly he almost missed it. Because humans still stop when somebody is afraid. The room went silent again after that. Somewhere above them, station alarms pulsed through the metal structure once more. Then every light in the corridor outside shifted suddenly from white to deep security red. The red security lights kept flashing through the corridor outside in slow, steady pulses, turning the storage room from amber to crimson and back again every few seconds. Ethan pushed himself off the terminal and moved toward the partially opened blast door. He listened carefully before looking outside. The freight corridor remained empty for the moment, but the station sounded different now. Tighter. More alert. Somewhere far above them, heavy doors were sealing between sectors with deep metallic echoes that carried through the structure of the station itself. Lockdown, Ethan muttered quietly. Behind him, Lyra stood up too fast from the crate. The movement made her sway slightly from exhaustion before she caught herself against the wall. Ethan noticed that immediately. Sit back down before you fall over. I am fine. You are terrible at lying. She lowered her eyes again, which Ethan was starting to realize usually meant he was right. He checked the station map on his wrist display once more. Most civilian transit routes were gone now. The freight elevators connecting to Dock 17 had been sealed remotely less than 2 minutes earlier. Their options were shrinking fast. Ethan leaned one shoulder against the wall beside the door and stared at the map longer than necessary. He could still leave. That thought kept circling quietly in the back of his head no matter how hard he ignored it. He still had a ship docked 3 sectors away. Still had enough fuel credits to get off Karth Station if he moved quickly and abandoned half his cargo. None of this belonged to him. The girl did not belong to him either. He had spent years learning how not to carry other people's disasters. Then he glanced over at Lyra. She was sitting on the crate again, with both hands wrapped around the metal water flask like she was trying to warm herself through the steel. The oversized station vent above her pushed cold, recycled air across the room, stirring loose strands of silver hair around her face. She looked exhausted enough to collapse, but she still kept glancing toward the door every few seconds like she expected somebody to come through it at any moment. Ethan looked away first. How old are you? He asked quietly. Lyra blinked at the question like it surprised her. 19. You look younger. Your species ages differently. Ethan nodded once. Fair enough. Silence settled over the room again. Not uncomfortable silence exactly. Just the kind that forms between two tired people who do not know each other well enough yet. Outside, another announcement echoed faintly through the freight corridors. Unauthorized vessel departures temporarily suspended. Security inspections in progress. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. That sounds expensive, he muttered. Lyra looked toward him carefully. You should leave before this becomes worse. Ethan gave a short, tired laugh, without humor. Little late for that now. I mean it. Her voice softened. You helped me already. That was more than anyone else would have done. Ethan rubbed one hand across the back of his neck. The old scar near his shoulder ached the way it always did when stress and exhaustion started mixing together. You know, he said slowly, people keep saying that today, that nobody else would help you. Lyra stared down at the floor. Because they will not. Ethan studied her quietly for several seconds. There was no self-pity in her voice when she said it. No anger either. Just certainty, like she had already tested the truth enough times to stop questioning it. That hit him harder than he expected. Somewhere down the corridor, a transport cart rolled past on damaged rails with a shriek of old metal. Lyra flinched instantly at the sound. Not dramatic, just automatic. Ethan saw it anyway. He had seen versions of that reaction before in refugees pulled out of colony raids years ago. Bodies that stayed afraid long after the danger passed. He crouched near his cargo bag and dug through one of the lower compartments before pulling out a folded thermal blanket, still sealed in station packaging. Cheap emergency issue. Thin silver fabric designed to hold body heat during depressurization accidents. He held it toward her casually. Here. Lyra froze again. Ethan waited. Slowly she reached out and accepted the blanket with both hands. Her fingers brushed his for less than a second before pulling away immediately. She unfolded the thin silver material carefully and wrapped it around her shoulders. The relief on her face lasted only an instant before she tried to hide it. Ethan pretended not to notice. Then the station lights flickered once overhead. A second later, somebody began pounding hard on the freight corridor door somewhere outside the room. The pounding came again, harder this time. Metal striking metal somewhere out in the freight corridor beyond the storage room walls. Lyra went completely still. Not frozen from surprise. Frozen from recognition. Ethan saw it immediately in her face. Her breathing stopped. Her shoulders locked beneath the silver thermal blanket. The hand holding the edge of the fabric trembled once before tightening into a fist. Another impact echoed through the corridor outside. A voice shouted something too distant to understand clearly. Then came the low mechanical whine of a scanning drone powering up. Ethan moved toward the blast door without thinking about it. He lowered himself beside the narrow opening and listened carefully. More voices now. At least 3 people. Security teams sweeping the freight sector room by room. Stay here, he said quietly. Lyra shook her head immediately. No, if they see us both moving, we are done. Please. Her voice cracked softly around the word. Do not leave me alone. Ethan looked back at her. She was trying hard to stay composed, but fear had already hollowed out her expression again. He realized suddenly that this might not even be about the officers anymore. It might simply be the fear of somebody walking away and never coming back. That thought settled heavily in his chest for reasons he did not want to examine too closely. Another metallic bang. Sounded outside, closer this time. Ethan made a decision. All right, he said quietly. Then stay close. Relief crossed Lyra's face so quickly and so honestly that Ethan had to look away from it almost immediately. He stepped back from the blast door and scanned the room fast. Old cargo crates. Broken terminal station. Maintenance ladder leading upward into a ventilation access shaft near the rear wall. There. Come on. They crossed the room quickly but carefully. Ethan pulled the rusted ladder down while Lyra stood watch near the door, every few seconds glancing toward the corridor outside, as if expecting it to open at any moment. The shaft above them was narrow and dark, lined with old coolant pipes that hummed softly inside the walls. Ethan climbed first, hauling his cargo bag over one shoulder. Lyra followed close behind him, without complaint despite how exhausted she looked. The maintenance shaft stretched almost 40 feet above the freight sector before leveling into an old service tunnel barely tall enough to crawl through. Dust coated every surface. The air smelled stale and metallic, untouched for years. Ethan pushed forward slowly on his hands and knees while the station vibrated faintly beneath them from distant cargo engines somewhere far below. Behind him, Lyra moved almost silently despite the cramped space. "You have done this before," she whispered after several minutes. Ethan glanced back briefly. "Moved through places nobody wanted me." A tired half-smile crossed his face. "More than once." Lyra studied him quietly after that. They reached a wider maintenance junction where Ethan finally stopped long enough to check the station map again. The old service tunnel connected to an abandoned observation platform overlooking the lower docking rings. If they were lucky, nobody would still monitor it. If they were unlucky, well, Karth Station had already become one long chain of bad options anyway. Ethan rubbed one hand across his eyes. He was tired enough now that the dull ache behind them had started spreading into his temples. He had not slept properly in almost 30 hours. Lyra noticed immediately. "You should rest," she said softly. Ethan gave a quiet laugh under his breath. "Right after I finish helping the mysterious girl everybody on this station is hunting." Lyra lowered her gaze. "I am sorry. Stop apologizing." His voice came out gentler than he intended. Silence settled between them again while the station hummed around them like some enormous sleeping machine. Then Ethan noticed something strange. Lyra had moved closer during the conversation without realizing it. Not touching him exactly, just near enough that her shoulder almost brushed his arm in the narrow tunnel. People did not drift closer to things they feared. Ethan looked at her for a second beneath the dim emergency lighting. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion now. She kept blinking slower each time. "When was the last time you slept?" he asked quietly. Lyra hesitated too long. Ethan sighed softly. "That bad, huh?" Before she could answer, a sharp burst of static crackled suddenly through the maintenance speakers hidden somewhere inside the tunnel walls. Then a calm official voice echoed through the darkness above them. "Attention, all station personnel. Sector lockdown remains active. Priority retrieval team has entered the lower docking rings." Lyra's face drained of color instantly. Then the voice continued. "The target is not to be harmed." The words echoed through the maintenance tunnel long after the announcement ended. The target is not to be harmed. Ethan sat very still beneath the dim emergency lighting, listening to the low electrical hum inside the walls while Lyra's breathing turned uneven beside him again. Most hunted people were called dangerous, armed, violent, security threats. Nobody locked down an entire station and sent retrieval teams after a frightened 19-year-old girl unless something much bigger sat underneath the story. Ethan looked toward her slowly. "Lyra," he said quietly. "Who exactly are they afraid of losing?" She did not answer immediately. Her eyes stayed fixed somewhere down the dark tunnel ahead, like she was deciding how much truth he deserved. Ethan had seen that look before too. Refugees deciding whether trusting somebody was worth surviving another day. Finally, she lowered her head. Slightly. "I did not lie to you," she whispered. "I did not do anything wrong. I believe that." That surprised her enough that she looked up quickly. Ethan shrugged faintly. "You do not act like somebody running from punishment." He paused. "You act like somebody running from being taken back." Lyra stared at him for several seconds in complete silence. Then, very slowly, she nodded once. The tunnel around them vibrated faintly as another heavy transport vessel passed through the lower docking rings somewhere beneath the station. Dust drifted from the ceiling pipes in thin gray clouds. Ethan leaned back against the cold metal wall and waited without pushing her further. After a while, Lyra finally spoke again. "There are families where I come from," she said softly, "that believe blood matters more than people." Ethan listened quietly. "My family is one of them." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the silver thermal blanket wrapped over her shoulders. "I was supposed to stay where they placed me. Speak when instructed. Smile when instructed. Marry who they selected." She swallowed once before continuing. "I left." Ethan stared at her for a moment. "That is it." A faint, bitter expression crossed her face. "For some people, that is enough." Silence settled between them again. Ethan rubbed one tired hand across his jaw. "So the entire station is hunting you because you ran away from your family?" Lyra hesitated. "Not exactly." Ethan gave her a look. For the first time since meeting her, Lyra almost looked embarrassed. "They are important." "How important?" She lowered her voice further. "Very." Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose. Of course, somewhere in the universe, he had apparently crossed paths with the one runaway girl capable of shutting down an entire trade station. He should have found that unbelievable. Instead, he mostly felt tired. Lyra watched his reaction carefully. "You are angry." "No," Ethan said honestly. "Just trying to understand how much trouble I accidentally adopted today." That earned the faintest flicker of warmth in her eyes again. Small, fragile, gone almost immediately. Then her expression changed. Ethan noticed it. Instantly. She was looking past him, now toward the far end of the tunnel. Listening. Ethan turned carefully. At first he heard nothing except the distant groan of the station itself. Then faintly, somewhere below them, came the low mechanical whine of scanning drones moving through the maintenance levels. Closer than before. Lyra shifted nearer without seeming aware of it. Ethan could practically feel the tension radiating off her now beneath the cold air of the tunnel. "They are getting closer," she whispered. Ethan nodded once. "Yeah." He checked the station map again, but most of the lower sectors were already blocked by security sweeps. Only one path remained open now. The abandoned observation platform overlooking Dock 17. Not safe exactly, just less exposed than the tunnels. Ethan shoved the wrist display dark again and pushed himself carefully to his feet. Lyra rose immediately with him. Too quickly. The motion made her sway hard from exhaustion before catching herself against the wall. Ethan reached out automatically and steadied her arm before she fell. Lyra froze at the contact. So did Ethan. For one strange quiet second, neither of them moved. Her skin felt ice cold beneath the thin sleeve of her clothing. Ethan released her gently the moment she regained balance. "Easy," he said softly. Lyra looked down at the floor. "Nobody has touched me kindly in a very long time." The sentence landed harder than Ethan expected. Before he could think of an answer, the tunnel speakers crackled alive once more. Then a calm, unfamiliar voice filled the darkness above them. "Lyra Vale," the voice said evenly. "If you can hear this, your grandmother has arrived at Karth Station." The voice vanished from the tunnel speakers, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the announcement itself. Ethan stared at Lyra while the dim emergency lights flickered across the narrow maintenance shaft around them. Her face had gone pale beneath the violet tone of her skin. Not fear exactly. Something more complicated than that. Exhaustion. Dread. Maybe grief. "Your grandmother," Ethan repeated quietly. "The very important kind of family." Lyra closed her eyes briefly and nodded once. Ethan let out a slow breath through his nose. "You know, most people start with that information. Most people stop helping when they hear it." Ethan could not argue with that. Somewhere below them, the sound of scanning drones drifted closer through the station structure. The search teams were tightening the perimeter around the lower docking rings exactly the way trained retrieval units always did. Slow, careful, no panic. Which meant whoever wanted Lyra back had resources far beyond ordinary station security. Ethan pushed himself fully upright inside the cramped tunnel and adjusted the strap of his cargo bag. "Come on," he said quietly. "Observation platform is another 200 feet ahead." Lyra rose immediately beside him, still wrapped tightly in the silver thermal blanket. She looked exhausted enough to collapse where she stood, but the mention of her grandmother had driven all traces of sleep from her face. They moved deeper through the maintenance shaft together while the station groaned softly around them. Every few minutes another announcement echoed faintly through the walls. Civilian movement restricted. Lower sectors under temporary authority control. Docking clearance suspended. Ethan had spent enough years around frontier stations to recognize what was happening now. Somebody powerful had arrived. The entire station was reshaping itself around that fact. Ahead, the tunnel finally widened into an abandoned observation corridor overlooking Dock 17 through thick reinforced windows coated with years of dust. Ethan slowed as they entered. The docking ring beyond stretched beneath them like a steel canyon filled with cargo haulers, maintenance rigs, fuel lines, and moving security teams. Red emergency lights flashed across polished metal surfaces below. At the center of the docking bay sat a ship Ethan had never seen before. Long white. Silent. Not military exactly, but expensive in the way only old power could afford to be. Its surface reflected the station lights like pearl beneath water. Smaller vessels had already cleared the surrounding docks to make room for it. Lyra stopped walking beside him. Ethan noticed her hands. tightened around the thermal blanket again. "That hers?" he asked softly. Lyra nodded once. "My grandmother does not travel often." Ethan studied the ship below for several seconds. Dock workers moved carefully around it, while armed escorts lined the platform entrances in dark silver uniforms unlike any station security he recognized. Nobody looked relaxed near them. Nobody even looked upward. "You were not kidding about important," Ethan muttered. Lyra stayed silent. Then, after a moment, she whispered something so quietly he almost missed it. "She will not hurt me." Ethan looked sideways at her. "But..." Lyra's eyes remained fixed on the ship below. "She will take me home." The way she said home sounded less like a place and more like a locked room. Ethan leaned one shoulder against the observation wall and rubbed tiredly at his jaw. He should hand her over. That was the sensible choice now. Nobody could accuse him of not helping. He had gotten her this far, kept her safe through the lockdown, fed her, hidden her, more than most people on Karth Station would have done. But every time he thought about walking away, he remembered the look on her face in the market when she grabbed his sleeve like she had already run out of hope everywhere else. Below them, a transport lift descended beside the white ship. Several figures emerged onto the docking platform, surrounded by escorts. Even from this distance, one figure immediately stood apart from the others. Tall, elderly, draped in pale silver robes that moved softly in the docking bay wind. The workers nearby lowered their heads as she passed. Ethan felt Lyra tense beside him instantly. "That is her," Lyra whispered. Ethan studied the woman below carefully. There was nothing visibly cruel about her. Nothing threatening. Yet the entire docking ring bent around her presence like gravity itself had changed. Then the older woman stopped walking. Slowly, she lifted her head toward the observation levels above the dock. Toward them. Ethan felt something cold settle quietly into his stomach. Because even through layers of reinforced glass and 200 feet of distance, he knew with absolute certainty that Lyra's grandmother had just found them. For a long moment, neither Ethan nor Lyra moved. The observation platform remained silent except for the distant mechanical sounds drifting up from the docking ring below. Cargo loaders humming across steel rails. Station announcements echoing through overhead speakers. The low vibration of the white ship resting at the center of the dock, like something ancient and patient. Far beneath the dusty observation windows, Lyra's grandmother continued looking upward directly toward them. Ethan did not know how she could possibly see them through the darkened glass from that distance. Somehow he was certain she could. Beside him, Lyra's breathing had gone shallow again. "Can she actually see us?" Ethan asked quietly. Lyra nodded once without taking her eyes off the docking platform below. "Probably." Ethan let out a tired breath. "That feels unfair." For the first time in several minutes, the corner of Lyra's mouth moved slightly upward before fading again. Then movement spread across the docking ring beneath them. The silver-uniformed escorts began repositioning around the platform entrances while station security officers stepped back out of their way immediately. Nobody argued with them. Nobody delayed them. Ethan watched carefully as one of the escorts approached Lyra's grandmother and handed her a data tablet. The older woman barely glanced at it before speaking quietly to the officer beside her. A second later, every scanning drone in the docking ring abruptly powered down at once. The sudden silence that followed felt strange after hours of alarms and searches. Ethan frowned slightly. "What just changed?" Lyra swallowed once. "She found me." Ethan looked at her. "That does not explain why they stopped searching." Lyra finally turned away from the observation glass. Her silver hair shifted softly against the thermal blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Because she knows I will come to her." Ethan studied her face carefully. There was resignation there now beneath the exhaustion. Not relief. Not safety. Just somebody preparing herself to go back somewhere she no longer wanted to belong. Ethan leaned against the wall beside the window and folded his arms quietly across his chest. "Do you want to go?" Lyra looked down immediately. Silence stretched between them for several seconds before she finally answered in a voice barely above a whisper. "No." The honesty of it settled heavily in the empty observation corridor. Ethan rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. "Then do not." Lyra looked up sharply. Genuine surprise crossed her face again, almost painful in how unfamiliar it seemed to her. "You do not understand," she said softly. "If I run again, they will follow forever." "Maybe." Ethan shrugged slightly. Families are good at that. A faint sad expression touched her eyes. You joke when you are tired. I joke when things get complicated. He looked back down toward the docking ring below. Unfortunately for me, complicated seems to like me lately. Lyra stepped closer beside him near the observation glass. Below them, the older woman still stood motionless beside the white ship while escorts and station officials moved carefully around her. Even from this distance, Ethan could feel the gravity of her presence. The kind of authority that made entire stations rearrange themselves without being asked twice. She is not cruel, Lyra said quietly after a while. That is what makes this difficult. Ethan glanced sideways at her. You are afraid of disappointing her. Lyra closed her eyes briefly. I am afraid she only loves the version of me that obeys. The words landed in the quiet space between them with painful softness. Ethan looked away toward the docking ring again because suddenly he understood everything much more clearly than he wanted to. It was never really about punishment, or power, or station security. It was about a girl who had spent her whole life being important to everyone except herself. Somewhere below, one of the docking bay doors slowly opened beside the white ship. Warm golden light spilled across the platform floor beneath the station reds and silvers. Lyra stared at it silently. Then, after several long seconds, she asked the question so quietly Ethan almost missed it. If I leave with her, she whispered, would you come with me? Ethan looked at her slowly. Lyra stood beside him wrapped in a cheap silver thermal blanket, exhausted beyond words, violet eyes uncertain in a way no powerful family could ever hide completely. For the first time since they met in the market, she was not asking him to save her. She was asking him not to let her face the next part alone. And somewhere deep inside himself, Ethan realized he had already known his answer for hours.